So I've done my fair share of complaining. I've clearly pointed out the things that I do not like about this game, and the things that I believe need to change. To quickly sum it up, the game doesn't have enough options for interesting gameplay. I mean, the PvE is just trying to get as much damage into your enemies as possible in the shortest amount of time, and for a higher difficulty they just increase the health bars and the damage numbers. And PvP in the Dark Zone is pretty much the same, but instead of using cover to cover, you just dodge roll around the place and blind fire, hoping that your enemy misses more shots than you do. And with the pulls, the first aid and the survivor link being so much better than the rest, this is anything but an RPG experience, let alone a cover-based shooter. On top of that, this game is also supposed to be a loot-driven shooter game, except loot isn't that exciting nor as rewarding, and you usually find yourself deconstructing anything you find for some more crafting materials. However, coming up with a good solution that would fix all and every one of these issues is not easy, but that is the thing that I've been keeping myself busy with these past few weeks. Now, I am by no means a game developer. I mean, all I ever worked on was this thing which ended up being used for a parody video, but I have played the game a lot myself. I have been going around asking for other people's opinions, both people on my friend list and randoms online, and I have been putting that all together. I took notes, I wrote stuff down, and on a bigger scale, I think everyone's complaints pretty much fall into the same category, and thus I decided to make work out of it. With their feedback and of course my own impressions, I've worked on something that I believe would fix almost all of these issues. It would make PvE gameplay more interesting, it would make PvP truly a cover-based RPG experience, and it would make loot drops a key and interesting part of the game that would not only reward the player but also complement the build that they are going for. The best of this all is that it doesn't require the game to be changed in any dramatic way. Yeah, some smaller features have to be removed and moved around, and you know, some work is going to have to go into this, but it was important to me that all of the changes are doable, something that didn't take too much development time and something that didn't change the core of this game in any way. Now, in this video I also want to explain the reasoning behind every change that I made to the game, and that will be a pretty lengthy thing, so I'm cutting this whole solution into two parts. First, we're going to talk about how to make the gameplay more interesting, how to change the PvP into a cover-based RPG shooter, and you know, all that stuff. And then in the next video, I will be talking about how to make that interesting gameplay more rewarding with some changes to the loot. And with all of that out of the way, let's get this thing started. Before we begin adding stuff to the game or changing stuff around, I think it is a good idea to remove some features first. Currently, the game has a few things that I believe feel kind of out of place, and I think that getting rid of these would do nothing but good stuff. Firstly, we have the different type of grenades, and they need to go. On paper, having 6 different type of grenades, each with their own unique crowd control effects, you know, that's really cool. But the reality is that they aren't really used for crowd control at all, and they're only used to flush NPCs out of cover or to zone a specific area in PvP. Good players will never really get hit, that's because of the red indicator that appears even before the grenade has landed, and thus you don't really ever get to stun or disrupt another player. I feel that the only times that I can actually hit another player is when the other player makes a mistake, either by carelessly running into my grenade when I drop it around the corner, or by simply not playing careful enough. It is never because I had such a nice throw, so to speak. It only works versus players that aren't paying much attention or are just not that good to begin with. And this is a very bad game mechanic because that means that it doesn't work versus good players, and thus you're lacking a lot of crowd control options versus good players. But let's assume for a second that we live in a perfect world and that somehow, in some way, you can land every grenade that you wanted. You can land every grenade that you throw. You don't find them clunky to use because you're using the hotkeys on your keyboard, and you have practiced enough with them to use them effectively. If that is the case, I still think that they should be removed. Why? Well, because it makes it so that every player can max out their damage, max out their health, and still have all the crowd control options that they ever need. In this perfect world scenario, there is no reason to ever give up your damage for any type of crowd control, which kinda defeats the purpose of having different roles in the first place. And on top of all of that, I think it's also pretty stupid that the enemies have no way of knowing what kind of grenade was thrown at them. You have all these statistics with bleed resistance, blind resistance, shock resistance, and so on, so if you had a way of telling what kind of crowd control was thrown at you, you would know what to be afraid of and what not. But for all you know, every red circle is a disrupt or a burn grenade, which is what my character is most vulnerable to. So out of safety, you have to roll away anyway, essentially giving each player up to 14 grenades to just toss at enemies, to just zone them. I have nothing against the normal grenades, but it's better if the special ones are removed. The next thing that in my opinion needs to go are the consumables. I like the idea of the medkits. They are very useful for solo players and can keep players alive even without having a dedicated healing skill equipped. But the explosive rounds and the incendiary rounds and all the food and water, all of that stuff really needs to go. The thoughts behind this are very similar to the grenades. Not only are the consumables quite annoying to use at times, especially when you play with a controller, but the enemy also has, again, no way of knowing what or when you consume one of these. So there's very little counterplay. You never know if and when anyone has used incendiary ammo until you are suddenly set on fire, at which point it may already be too late. Besides that, things such as the incendiary ammo also make it quite pointless to ever spec into any crowd control or utility, because you can just max out your damage and then add one of the strongest crowd control options on top of that with just one click of the button. And remember how I said that I didn't think that this game had enough reliable crowd control options, with of course grenades not being reliable enough? Well, incendiary ammo is one of the most reliable ways, because it's pretty much a guaranteed set someone on fire button. But this is also where I have an issue with it, because I don't think that the most reliable way of crowd control should come from these consumables. I feel like all of the effects of the consumables should be found back in the skills, the weapon, or the gear talents. Take for example the energy bar. This thing removes all the negative status effects and prevents them from being applied for 5 seconds. Now, how about you turn this into a weapon talent that, for example, a tank player can use? Just to name something here, for every X amount of seconds in combat, or every X amount of damage taken or dealt, you get 5 seconds immunity the next time that you are affected by any form of crowd control, and this can stack up to 2 times. A simple but useful talent, again something that tank players may want to take over a flat damage or health buff. Now, before I leave this topic and move on to the next thing, I'd also like to add that explosive ammo is currently straight up broken. The extra damage that comes from these explosions is seen as exotic damage, and your armor mitigation does not protect you from that. I was streaming with it the other day and I was literally just one-shotting people all day with the M44 sniper. It got to the point where people started calling me a hacker. And as much fun as I may have had with that, I don't think that this is good for the game. So massive, if you're watching and if you want to take any advice out of this video at all, please consider disabling special ammo in PvP. The last thing that we're going to remove for now are the signature skills. Simply put, they are too strong and the long cooldowns do not compensate for their power, as there is usually a lot of time in between fights versus players, which makes it so that you never see a fight without the use of these signature skills. Not only that, but the survivor link in itself renders a lot of the defensive skill setups like the mobile cover, the smart cover, or the healing station completely useless. If you see a well-coordinated team set up their defensive skills, you simply just pop your survivor link and then the other players are still forced to either run away or activate the survivor link themselves. It just becomes a game of dodge rolling into each other and baiting out the next survivor link until one team or another has used all 4 of them, in which case they are forced to run away and then the game turns into a game of cat and mouse. And I've already said this before, but I do not like this at all. It destroys any RPG or cover-based shooter element that this game had to begin with, and I think it's best if we remove this and then replace it with something else later into the video. And those are pretty much the things that I wanted to remove from the game before I started adding stuff back in. What we have left now is a much more basic version of the game. We don't have consumables, we don't have different type of grenades, so we're lacking a lot of CC options there, and we also don't have our signature skills. Now, don't get me wrong, in this scenario, raw damage numbers are still king, and at this very moment, pulse and first aid will probably still be the best 2 skills in the game, even without the survivor link. At this point, much of the game's problems aren't solved yet, but that brings us to our next step, and that is to add back features into the game to make utility, dedicated tanks, and healers a lot more valuable and bring back the RPG to this game. So the first step we're going to take is to buff a lot of the skills and some of the weapons. Not by damage, no, we already have enough damage, but by giving them a lot more utility and crowd control options. This is really the moment where we can get creative. You can give the ballistic shield a mod where players have a certain chance of being blinded when shooting at it. Or you can have a sticky bomb mod that can stun everyone in the area, and you can have a lot more talents on weapons that can trigger any form of crowd control effect. Then, after that, we have to make the crowd control effects themselves a lot stronger. For example, allow players to reapply the same type of crowd control to an enemy even though he is already affected by it. Right now, we're making crowd control really, really powerful. And I know what you're thinking right now, that all of this stuff may sound very overpowered. And that is very true. These changes would make crowd control a very strong competitor to raw damage numbers, and probably, in a lot of situations, more powerful as well. But that is where the next change comes in. Because we're going to make it so that every player is immune to crowd control as long as they are in cover. And this is gonna change a lot of things. First up, it will make it so that players who are in cover cannot be stunned, cannot be put on fire, and they cannot be blinded or any of that stuff. But players who are trying to rush and basically do that dodge roll shit that you see right now in the dark zone, that can be punished very, very hard. These changes make positioning a lot more important because being out of position can result in an instant death. It gives skills such as the mobile cover also a lot more value. It will prevent people from endlessly running away because they can just get stun locked, and that will also make players think twice before going rogue. And as long as you are in cover, you can feel safe, and above all, you can utilize a lot of the cover-based skills and talents that feel a little bit underwhelming in the current state of the game. Last up, I want to add back the signature skills, but make some changes to it so that they aren't the most overpowered thing in the world. Now, I am aware of the fact that on controllers, you are required to press both bumpers at the same time to activate these signature skills. So control-wise, they cannot be anything as complicated to use as, for example, the healing station, where you can double tap it or you can throw it and, you can deactivate it as well. The signature skills need to be a one-press ability, otherwise it's just gonna feel clunky. But if you cannot make these abilities require skill by aim or positioning, then make it require skill by timing. The recovery link is a good example of a well-balanced signature skill. It's only useful in some scenarios and not completely overpowered. But what they could, for example, do with the survivor link is that it should work for only one person, and then make it so that when you activate it and then you get the 0 health within the next 5 seconds, you get a full refill, plus you get 5 seconds of invulnerability. Pretty much the same thing that happens when you get revived. You are, invulnerable for a few seconds. However, if you activate it and you do not fall to 0 health within that time, then nothing happens. This makes it very skill-based, timing-wise, because both you and your enemies will have a visual cue that you activated it, and the enemies will have to stop shooting immediately to prevent its effect, while you have to try to activate it at the last second so that the enemies have no time to stop shooting you. This does two things for it. It removes a lot of its guaranteed pushing power, while still keeping what I believe is the intended reason for it, and that is to get out of nasty situations. And it does all of that while also adding a higher skill ceiling to the game, and again, make the gameplay just a little more interesting. And what this leaves us with is a cover-based RPG shooter game where players have a good reason to use cover, and a game that provides more interesting gameplay. And with this new crowd control heavy gameplay style, it opens up a lot of doors for the PvE side of things as well. Think about new enemies that can only be taken down when under the effect of this or that debuff, or enemies that need to be hard countered in a certain way. Again, that would make for a lot more interesting fights than simply just a flat damage and a health increase for NPCs at a higher difficulty. Which of course can also help to make future incursions a lot more enjoyable, even if they are just wave-based. On top of that, NPCs could also dish out more crowd control themselves. We all know how dangerous those stun drones were the first time that we did the incursion, so why not add more enemies to the game that have such abilities? Make it more interesting. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, this is a 2-part series and I talked about the gameplay right here today, and soon enough I will drop part 2 here on my channel where I will talk about how I would change the loot and the rewards in this game to make it more substantial and, well, more rewarding. Of course, everything pointed out right here is open to feedback, so if you have anything to add or disagree with any of my points, then of course, let me know and let me know why. Again, I'm not a game developer and I do not expect any of these changes to ever come into effect, but I did want to share what I've been working on and what direction I would take the game if I was in charge of it. And that is pretty much all that I have to say today. As always, I will see you guys later, or like they say, in the Netherlands. Zie je later!